So good afternoon. For those of you who are in the US, good morning to our West Coast friends and anyone around the world. It's great to be together virtually. Looking forward to getting together more in person sometime soon. My name is José Isasi. I am Duke class of 1989, a proud native North Carolinian, although I now live in Chicago and where I practice law with the law firm of Jones Day. I'm here because the Duke University Hispanic and Latino Alumni Association, also known as DULA, is serving as a co-sponsor of the program. And DULA is an organization that is dedicated to promoting the interests of Duke by promoting the identity of Hispanic and Latinx students, professors, faculty, and lecturers at Duke. We aid Duke in recruiting and retaining, as well as alums to foster a sense of identity and continue a connection with Duke University. I have put on my screen my email address. If there's anyone who's interested in learning more about DULA, certainly reach out to me. You can also, through your online Duke alumni profile, go and register. You do not need to be a Latino or Latina. You don't need to be Hispanic to join. We have a good time. It's certainly worth getting to know us a little bit more. This program is part of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, which, as you all are aware, is an interdisciplinary educational program which offers learning opportunities throughout the year, showcasing Duke's faculty as well as alumni in thematically organized courses, combining lectures, panel discussions, and workshops that are being offered virtually. Today's program, Using Art to Inspire Change, is the final program for our course, Social Movements and Change Agents. This particular theme explores how societal change happens and what changes have been made in recent years, as well as those that are ongoing. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce our speaker for the presentation, Professor Pedro Lasch. He's a research professor of art history, and visual studies, as well as being a visual artist himself, and a member of the 16 Beaver, being an organizer of 16 Beaver, which is something you should definitely ask him about when you get a moment. He's the director of the Franklin Humanities Institute Social Practice Lab, and he himself has both had solo as well as group exhibits around the world. Trained as both a painter and a printmaker, has expanded beyond those media, and we'll hear more about that. The course on Coursera that he teaches, called The Art of the MOOC, it's available. It talks about the role of art in social movements and how it inspires change. So without further ado, Professor Lasch, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jose, and thank you also, Joe, and the organizers. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And I know with these webinar events, we don't get to see you as an audience, but that doesn't mean that we are not ready to engage. So in the last part, we'll have a chance to have Q&A and conversation with me and Jose. So you can also, if you have comments or questions as we go along, just throw them into the chat. Yes, I mean, I've also almost become a North Carolinian also, Jose, you know, like I was born and raised in Mexico City, from immigrant parents themselves in Mexico. And then I kind of moved to New York, lived there for about 9 years, where I studied and worked at the Cooper Union. And then I was hired by Duke in 2002. And so I've been here ever since. So I think this is the place where I've lived the longest by now in my life. So I feel very much like a North Carolinian, but of course I'm very happy to see all the changes that have happened in this state that make it more and more international. Like, to me, it's incredible that all the projects we do at Duke that are so big in scope and ambition, but also that are that are basically reach people around the world. And so we'll start my presentation with the example that already Jose mentioned, the art of the MOOC, to kind of show how that can happen. But then I have a lot of images to share that kind of, the idea is to share my perspective as an artist who also believes in activism. But mostly I brought stuff that we can then engage with in conversation. It doesn't matter whether you care for making art or not. That's not what today is about. I think rather than starting with a PowerPoint, I'll just share you a 3-minute video, and I will stop my camera while I do so, because I don't want you having to deal with 2 Pedros speaking at the same time. So you will see a video of me, and then I'll come back live through the Zoom, okay?
In the last few decades, public art and education have radically transformed themselves. They've moved from the fringe into becoming a space in which conversations around the world are occurring. What used to be thought of as a field with a big object and public space now is something that overlaps with social movements, grassroots culture, online platforms, all kinds of other interesting things. So now the artists, which was once considered an avant-garde, are now at the center of a very complex, very thought-provoking discussion. My name is Pedro Lasch, and I'm a Duke University professor and a visual artist. My name is Nato Thompson, chief curator at Creative Time. And we invite you to join us in this online course that is free, and it is called The Art of the MOOC, Merging Public Art and Experimental Education. In this course, you will make your own social projects as you learn with us and our guest presenters of all of these amazing transformations, the projects, the theories, the ideas, and the players around the world. And what's wonderful is we have an incredible roster of talent, from artists to curators to academics, who you could never get in the same room. And you could never actually have in a physical class. Online, we can actually have this and galvanize a very historic discussion. And we will always be challenging you and your peers around the world to be making work along these lines. We're now going to a special place that will highlight some of the things we want you to deal with. So come on and join us.
I will move it a little bit forward, and then I will. So this, what you're about to see, are like 3 very short examples of how the videos work in that Art of the MOOC series, and then I will stop.
The city basically took what was considered a very known, very sanctified artist and said, hey, let's make a sculpture of his. He called it a drawing that entered into space. They basically reenacted as accurately as they could the assassination in Texas, right, in Dallas. And they did it several times, so it was running on a loop, right? And a male actor, basically one of the members of Ant Farm, stood for Jackie, you know, so they created this parade, and then at the end of it, they had a human cannonball. Yeah. And this man flew over the border, and, you know, his body basically crossed international space. That's so awesome. We should watch it. Yeah, let's watch it.
Okay, so I just wanted to share these examples of how the video works, because I know some of you may have taken this Art of the MOOC on Coursera, but most of you probably haven't. So the reason I designed that series with a lot of you know, my students here at Duke, but also different colleagues and staff, was because I felt like there was a great need and desire from people around the world to understand contemporary art. People knew that, like, a lot, if you ask people what contemporary art is, they're they're interested, but they're also a bit confused and alienated by it. They really don't, and a lot of them get a sense that it's not only the kind of thing you see in museums, right, but that it happens elsewhere. But it's difficult to find information about it that feels accessible. So we wanted to do a series that was very casual, fast, you know, that doesn't feel like you have to read 500 books before you even understand the first thing. And then but still introduce people to really complex things fairly quickly. So what the clips that you saw are kind of in the first lecture, which is only, each lecture is only like half an hour long. You go from the most common assumption of a topic. So in this case, it's public monuments, right? Or public art. And then you start with the typical statues, you know, of heroes, to like the abstract sculptures, like the one you saw Nato Thompson talking about. But then you kind of start moving to the Vietnam Memorial, then to that ant farm reenactment. The whole idea of reenactment as memorials is that, you know, and then at the end, you're with in that crazy piece by this Venezuelan artist, you know, where Javier Tellez, where the man is flying over the US-Mexico border, right? If we had started with the last one, people would have said, well, that's not really art to me, or it's not really activism. But if you kind of gradually get there, you start understanding, even if you still disagree, you kind of get why someone would want to do something like that. And to kind of, I'll go now to share the PowerPoint. What I've prepared is kind of some images of artwork that kind of gives you a little bit of a context of my own artistic practice as an activist. I do a lot of artwork that has nothing to do with politics or activism, but for today's topic, of course, I've made selections that deal with activism. And so as an artist who's always cared for education and I've taught at Duke now for 20 years, but also I believe in that often we can't all be doing everything, right? So for example, Jose, you're a lawyer. Lawyers have their own, you know, way in which they can do politics or activism, right? They don't have to become politicians unless they want to. Same with artists. I don't think we have to, but we all can have a different function. But the most important thing, as I see it, is that we're connected, that we stay in touch with each other, and that we coordinate our efforts, right? Otherwise, nothing happens. And then it's kind of like when you see kids playing soccer and they all run after the ball all the time, and it's kind of funny to look at. And I think that sometimes when people get politicized and they feel like they want to do activism, that happens a little bit. Everybody thinks they all have to be doing the street work and the university work and the legal work. And the reality is that we can't. But if we do what we're best at and connect with each other, and we will go a lot longer way, no matter what the issue is that we care for. So I've always tried to assess what I am good at, but also what other people think I'm good at. Sometimes we think we're good at something, and it turns out we're not because others disagree. And so when you're working within a collective, you know, group or like an activist purpose, it's important to be realistic about that, right? About your skills, your abilities. Are you a good listener or not? And depending on that, you can play different roles in that group organization. The reason I wanted to introduce this Art of the MOOC series is because you can take these courses whenever you want. They're all offered on Coursera. And there's 3 of them. They are Public Art and Pedagogy. That's the first one we launched in 2015 with Creative Time. The Experiments with Sound, which is more about not just music and sound art, but also acoustics, like acoustic phenomena. And the Activism and Social Movements, which most directly addresses this issue of activism. But the reality is that all 3 courses deal with public culture, you know, and how we deal with difficult topics in our society. To my own surprise, when we launched this in 2015 with Creative Time, it was a total experiment. We were a bit afraid of the term massive online course because we thought, well, what if only 5 people sign up? Because let's face it, this socially engaged art thing at the time was not very popular. Like not that many people knew about it. And so we launched it with Coursera and Duke. And to my own surprise, like 5 years later, we have over 55,000 people enrolled in 134 countries. So when I was saying earlier how from North Carolina, we can launch something truly international, that's kind of what I meant. From this small town called Durham, we've launched what to this day, then probably forever, will be Creative Time's most international project with that many countries, 134 countries. I don't think they'll ever kind of beat that. And they're a really well-known public art institution in New York. They did the Tribute in Light, after 9/11. They did all kinds of the Kara Walker installation, right? So they've done all kinds of massive, big public art things, but this was so international in scope that I'm actually really happy and proud that we produced it from North Carolina. The way I designed the modules was that people enroll, they get it for free. One of the things I love about MOOCs and Coursera, the platform of Coursera, there's many different platforms, but one reason I wanted to go with Coursera is because they have a big range. There's everything from like high school students to retirees, to people who are professionals like curators and artists, to policymakers. Everybody's they just grab from Coursera what they want. And that's how I designed this course, because I think universities have something to offer for the larger society, not just for specialists. Of course, we need to work with specialists, and we should, right? That's our main goal as researchers and as instructors for our students who sign up in our classes. But then there's the mission we have beyond. And I designed this MOOC for the beyond, not necessarily for my students at Duke, That being said, the videos that we produce, because they're highly produced, like that, we use green screen all the time, and it took a lot of effort. I spent over 900 hours just to produce those courses before they even saw public engagement, And so those videos is kind of what you see in the red part of this diagram, right? Then we had these international scholars, artists, and activists who are the guest presenters. And those are done more interview style, but those are videos that people also watch. And then there were these meetups, Google Hangouts, at the time, Zoom was not the big thing that is now yet, 2015. But then one of the most exciting things is that learners do their own projects. So here you see in this diagram, kind of, it starts going in a circle where the learners, for example, when we launched this course in 2015, just in the first week, there were over 1,500 social interventions happening around the world. And of course, these interventions happened in the usual places like New York, Mexico City, Paris, London. But what I find the most exciting is that they happened in a small rural town in Portugal and in New Zealand and in South Africa, right? And that all of these smaller rural places that are usually excluded from art and culture, but also from global activism, they were connected through this kind of unit of the Art of the MOOC series. And so I've tried to really stay in touch with these types of audiences that then become participants as they make their own projects. Over the long run, it has become hard to sustain the learner's own project production, because you can imagine with 55,000, when we launched it, we had 8,000 to 10,000 in the first year. So that was still somewhat manageable with our peer assessment structure. But once you get 55,000, I see a lot less of the learners' projects by now, right? But I still love whatever I get to see through our social media channels. So if you're interested in enrolling any of these, just go to Coursera and look for if you look for Art of the MOOC in the search function, all 3 courses will pop up. And they're also, since this is also co-sponsored by the Latino Alumni Association, I put a lot of energy into these courses being offered as bilingual courses. So you can take them in Spanish if you want to as well. And so people across Latin America, but also Spanish-speaking populations in the US have been taking the courses a lot. So I kind of brought in some of the early, the initial images I'm showing all have to do with the first decade of this, century, and like how some of the main topics that I've been an activist about. In 2006, I was actually the director of Latino Studies at Duke. We weren't using the X at the time yet. It was Latina Studies, and I'm sure we'll be using many other letters in the future. The truth is that the X is kind of hard to do in Spanish. It's more of an English-speaking invention, if you ask me, but of course it has good reasons for being there, and so we can discuss that in the Q&A. But as director of Latino Studies, I was working a lot with specifically undergraduates, but also at the DULA at the time, to work with the massive immigrant rallies that were going on across the country in the US, but also, throughout the continent. But generally, I've been an advocate for not irresponsible borders, but open borders, right? I do think our world is organized too much for the free flow of goods and money, but not the free flow of people. And that is, there's a disconnect there that we can address as societies, right? It's not an easy one, but it's one that we should have frank and conversations about so we can fix the many problems, because it's people's lives that are at stake, right? A lot of people suffer from a broken system that we currently have. So I've stayed through the last two decades involved in this issue of immigrant activism, border activism. I'm also very involved in racial justice struggles. There's, way before Black Lives Matter, I've been working with a lot of different organizations who care for racial justice, but also as someone growing up in Mexico, I was always very kind of aware of the injustices there as pertains to indigenous populations and so on. I was in New York when the Twin Towers were attacked. So of course I was shocked and outraged by that horrible, horrible attack. But then I was also really unhappy with how the attack was used for military, all types of unjustified military actions like the invasion of Iraq. So I've been always part of different, kind of anti-militarist activism. I can also talk about other issues like colonialism, debt, and so on. But rather than talk too much, I think I'll just show you some images of some of my early activist work. When I was a poor student in New York City, I would hand out these flyers with these kind of provocative statements that made people look twice, not really know what the issue was yet. When just looking like, when you have a hammer, there's this famous expression, when you have a hammer, every problem is a nail, So it was a bit of a metaphor for like approaching everything from a military perspective. But also there was, I was observing right after 9/11, this phenomenon where certain words were becoming not like, all of a sudden they had become like a bad word. Like to me, a refugee is not a bad thing. A refugee is someone we should care for, right? But all of a sudden the word refugee was becoming like a negative term. And so I, as an artist who cares for language, I also try to pay attention to that. There also, my work tends to take different, like you may look at this and think it's just wallpaper because it literally is wallpaper. They're designs I made for wallpaper, but it's actually inspired by the Pac-Man figures, but it's environmentalist wallpaper. So it makes you think of human consumption. What you're seeing, it's a bit vulgar, so I apologize for that, but you see Pac-Man is eating all the cherries and the world gets filled with these little poops, and here it's the inverse, Pac-Man is eating the entire environment and you get this. And this is the first iteration of this joking concept that at the time was more of a joke of like how we could solve all of our problems if we created a human being that can eat plastic and, shit oil or vice versa. And, I thought so many of our problems revolve around oil consumption, and people have become more and more aware of that. But if you think like 15, 20 years ago when I was making these works, it was really only kind of marginal activists and environmentalists who were making this type of statement. Before even the invasion of Iraq, there was the sanctions against Iraq. So I made works about that. And then I do just provocations. Like to me, this image is, it's not like a haha joke, but I made it in 2003 as the central image for a series of events that were happening in 21 cities around the world, which was called the First International Lunchtime Summit. And the events were about food justice, right? And the cities included Krasnoyarsk in Siberia, as well as Tucumán in Argentina. All people. There was Skopje in Macedonia, as well as the main cities like Paris and London and New York. But this image basically framed the whole thing. And it's a bit of a provocation because in the post-Cold War context, I think we're still struggling to find what the world is and how we interpret things, because for so many decades, the world was divided by the capitalists and the communists, right? And so when I made this image, it was a defiance of that construct, that basically saying, actually, that is over. on the one hand, but it's also, it never even was that simple to begin with, right? Like if you think of the Soviet flag and the McDonald's, they actually look very well together. If you look at it, you know, they match. But ideologically, of course, they seem to be total opposites. These are images you're seeing from the Lunchtime Summit. And all these, that was in Tucumán. In Tucumán, they did this 3-day festival all about soy, you know, the growing of soy, but also soy politics. And I've also done things like, this is an intervention I did in the North and South Korean border. Often there's these overlooked things. As an artist, I like to pay attention to things that are overlooked. So I myself just said the Cold War is over, right? And has been over for a long time. And yet the most militarized border on the planet is a product of the Cold War, and it's still there. It's the North-South Korea border. So this soldier you're seeing there is actually guarding that separation. This is the so-called demilitarized zone that separates the North and South Korea, the two countries. And so I did a project there in 2006 with the group 16 Beaver that Jose mentioned earlier, where we were trying to identify, it was called Between Us. And we were trying to identify within the Korean context, not just the obvious border with its militarized fences and mines, you know, but also parts of Korean society that have borders in them. You know, I'm very interested in this whole idea of micro borders that a lot of social theorists have been using. And so we were working with farm workers who were being displaced by expansions of US military bases. And these rice farms actually take decades. It takes 2 or 3 generations to create these rice farms. And then these no longer exist because they were displaced by the expansion of the base. As you can tell, there were a lot of young people, old people they asked me to speak to this, to the audience of Korean activists with a candle vigil. And it's both, of course, very inspiring to be part of these kinds of things, but then it's also devastating when people lose, you know, because they lost and they no longer have these rice farms. I will move very quickly. I mean, I produce maps and posters, etc. But I also, as a visual artist, I kind of make these provocations. To me, it's different when an artist does a work that tells you how to think or I call that propaganda. And propaganda has its function. In Spanish language, we don't have a distinction between advertisement and propaganda. They're the same thing. Like Coca-Cola does propaganda, just like Joseph Stalin did, you know? And they're the same word. It's called but in English you separate what is about selling a product is called advertising, and what is selling of ideology, right? Convincing people to do something is called propaganda, you know? And when we have the same word for both, we recognize that they actually overlap quite a bit. And so as an artist, I've done works that try to make people not just think, actually, I don't like making art that tells someone how to think, but I like to, for example, if you're trying to make an environmental point for people to think more about their waste, well, that's more like advertising and propaganda. But I also try to make work that really just opens up conversation. It leaves it entirely open for people. So for example, these maps from the Latino America series, the word Latino, I started them in 2003, and I've done them in museums, galleries, but also at t-shirts, at protests, and so on. And the word Latino has basically migrated north. So it's kind of boom center in the United States. And so one of the questions of the project is what happens when that happens? What happens to the entire continent? Of course, I don't think Latinos get to claim this country and the continent just for themselves. But it's kind of an invitation to think, well, what happens when the US becomes a bilingual country? I actually think it already is. It also is a bit of a reversal of what is the reality, which is that the US, English-speaking US, is the only country that says America calling to itself. You know, in every other country on the continent, America is the continent, el continente americano, right? Somos todos americanos. It's only in the US that people call themselves American, meaning the country. And the rest of the countries in the continent get the plural. They get to be the Americas, right, in the English language. And so this piece of Latin America was a bit of a counter provocation to that inequity, you know, to that imbalanced representation. And one of the versions of this piece is one where I've handed different people who I know are going to cross the US-Mexico border these folded maps. I wanted to do a work that isn't just about migration, but a work that actually migrates. And so what you're seeing is the maps are all identical when they start, but they end up showing them different migratory process. So someone who migrated undocumented, like my friend Vicencio, who had to hide in, you know, sewage water and then had machine guns pointed at him by, you know, Border Patrol, his map looks like this. Whereas someone who was the director of the Museo del Barrio at the time, Julian Sugasagoitia, who now directs a great museum in Kansas City, his map looks white because he travels by airplane, you know? So Latinos represent the whole scope of social classes, and we all have a very different migratory kind of history, including those Latinos that never migrated in the first place. One of the people who participated in that project is Tomas Ivara Frausto, who was the director of creativity at the Rockefeller Foundation. And he never migrated. He was born in Texas. He's always been Texan. And the border moved on him. He goes back like 6 or 7 generations in Texas. So when his great-great-grandparents lived there, that was Mexico. And then it became the US, you know? So it would be totally wrong to call him an immigrant, you know? He's not an immigrant, but he is a US Latino, right? And so there's many people like Tomas, and I thought it was also important to represent them. I work a lot with informal tradespeople. Here you see their street stands with DJs and sonideros. I'm going quickly through the images so I can stop soon and we can have a conversation. And this was a great dance we did here in Carborough, North Carolina, with all these sonideros from the area. People drove all the way from Atlanta for this party. I love the DJs, how they make these logos and so on. So you can see how many of them participated. And I also invited them to show all of the different kind of artwork that they make. And we had a panel discussion also with some scholars and the DJs themselves. Actually, Jose, this is the guy I mentioned. His name is Super Dengue, and he's the biggest sonidero from Winston-Salem. So, and here was the dance party. That was in Mexico City. We had over 2,000 people at this party. And then I worked a lot with this group in Tepito. Tepito is the place where sonideros were born. They kind of came out of there in the 80s. And it's kind of the Harlem of Mexico City, you know, like a lot of powerful street culture comes from there. But they're often erased from the more elite institutions. So for me, it was very important for them to be part of this whole process. So here you see a dance. I will just flip very quickly through these images. So you've seen it. I work a lot with mirror masks. This is in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, some of you may know of this black mirror installation I did at the National Museum, where people were asked to think about coloniality by looking at themselves reflected in these black mirrors. So the only way for them to see these pre-Columbian sculptures I was putting on display was by seeing themselves reflected in the same mirror as them. And then they realized that there was this ghost image behind of like Spanish artwork, Baroque artwork. The first time this got exhibited was in conjunction with the Greco to Velázquez exhibit that was at the Nasher. So over 80,000 people saw this in like 3 months that the exhibition was open to the public. I think I'll stop here. I have many more images, but I think it's important to leave room for conversation. So, Jose, I don't know, how do you want to transition to
Sure. So I'll toss out a first question that seems like a natural outgrowth from your presentation. I wonder whether or not art as a provocation, as you put it, is something that really that Latin America, South America can really claim, and I wonder that in part because in our country expression has been less constrained, less limited. My sense, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is that in lots of parts of Central and South America, art, street art, things like that was one of the few ways in which people could get political messages across, because you didn't have the same kinds of freedoms. And so it formed a really important part of any social justice movement.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I totally would have agreed that was the case up until fairly recently. You know, I think, and it doesn't mean necessarily that regimes have become much more democratic in the continent. That's not what I mean. What I think is what has changed is this country has changed in its relation to media and to news. And I'll clarify what I mean. I think up until maybe 7 or 8 years ago, perhaps a bit longer, in the US, there was a culture of, at least an attempt, it wasn't always that, but there was this attempt of a balanced, open journalism. You know, this idea that you report on the facts, and people, there is freedom of speech. There was this, and there still is a really staunch culture of freedom of speech. And in many other countries around the world, there were serious repercussions for speaking facts, for reporting on actual facts, for saying the truth, even if the truth was debatable. And the repercussions could be death, co-optation, or all kinds of other methods, you know? And so I think people definitely, that even for people who didn't use art, I think your comment definitely applies to even just something as basic as humor. Like in Mexico, growing up in Mexico, we all knew that we were living under a very thinly disguised dictatorship. We did vote, but it was a one-party system, right? So you always knew the result was going to be. The opposition never had a chance of winning. But then, so the place where you got your news was often on the comedy shows, because comedians were allowed. It's kind of like fables to have that tradition also in European history, you know, like if you can tell the story of the fox and the hen, you know, and everybody knows who the fox is, you know. It's also one of the reasons why Winnie the Pooh is actually banned in China. I mean, unofficially banned, because the current president of China, you know, knows that they use that figure to say negative things about him. And so, of course, what's silly about it is that beyond the issue of, you know, totalitarianism and censorship, is that, yes, they're using that figure to say negative things about him. So he should be concerned, right? But now they've canceled all images related to Winnie the Pooh, you know, so it's kind of crazy that something as innocent as Winnie the Pooh. And I think you're right that artists from Latin America have a really long tradition of doing that, whereas in the US, it's still a little bit in diapers. You know, people are just getting used to this type of practice, with the exception of, for example, minorities. Like African Americans have a long history in the US also of using art and culture to do certain things, because they were allowed, like Black people in this country have been allowed to perform on stage for much longer than they've been allowed to express their opinion on a news channel, right? And so they've also used jazz, and so it's kind of like Mexicans use cooking now, you know, or other things, because they're allowed, and the other thing they're not allowed to, you know. So there's kind of a rich history in this country also coming from minorities and women, I would say. But like women often have to play dumb and until they're given a certain platform, and then they can actually say the thing that they mean to say, you know. And so there's this kind of interesting comparison we could make. But just to kind of wrap up this question, where I would say this changed was that we've had a massive transformation of the news landscape in the last 6 years, I think. You know, what used to be a fringe practice of like making up stories and what used to be parody news, like you would see it on The Onion and like things like that, or in comedy shows. And artists, I did a lot of, I didn't do fake news, but I did works that kind of tried to play with fictions, never deceiving people, but really trying to see, well, what if this happens, you know? And it's very different when an artist or a comedian does that than when a politician does. Like when politicians and journalists embrace false news, we're in a whole other place. And so I think we're still figuring out how to deal with this. And of course, social media cannot be separated from that. But so that's where I would characterize your, you know, does that make sense? You know?
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is actually a really good segue to one of the questions that's been posed by one of the attendees, which is to focus now on this most recent time. Has the latest unrest that we've experienced in this country, racial unrest, immigrant unrest, things like that, change activist art in your mind? Is it created a greater urgency? Is it easier? Is it harder? How have these recent events in our country impacted you?
I mean, I think it's going to take us a generation or two to figure out what is going on right now across the spectrum. So I can tell you my opinion, but I would never dare say that that's what's, you know, that I feel like we have such great simultaneous contrasts. On the one hand, it seems like for those of people who've been fighting for more rights for diverse populations and so on, it seems like a time of incredible setbacks, and yet at the same time, huge victories, you know, and it's so hard to make sense of it all, you know. Like entire school systems are thinking of changing their textbooks at the same time as we have defunding of, you know, major things going on. So I would say that it is a fascinating and really interesting time to be a journalist, and it's also a fascinating and really interesting time to be an activist. One thing that I think we need to pay more attention to, and for example, someone in the chat wrote that he or she is signing off because this seemed like an advert for something else and not an actual course. I'm not sure what she meant, but if she may have meant that maybe there was a politics in there that she doesn't identify. I don't know. I can't interpret because she didn't stay, but I would have loved to have a conversation with her. But sometimes I think we have falsely assumed that a way of doing activism in one way is only attached to one particular politics. So in other words, if you go to the street to protest, you must be a leftist. And I think all of those assumptions have been thrown out the window in the last few years. Like people across the political spectrum are doing all forms of activism. You know, social media disinformation, like they're doing like street protests, they're doing like, I mean, the strategies of someone like Marjorie Greene with her, what she puts on her face, they would have been straight out of the book from like 20 years ago of leftist activists, you know, and vice versa, you know. So I think we all, if we're honest, we all need to look at what people are doing and learn what we can, but also say we can't assume, like, for example, with my work with the mirror mask, I always have to remind people think masks are liberatory because I'm talking about Zapatista, indigenous activists, right? And they wear the ski mask. But the same a mask can be used for the KKK, you know, like you can mask yourself and do terrible things, you know, with a mask. And so I don't think an activist tool in itself defines a politics. It depends what you do with that tool, you know? And so as artists, we can be part of certain social movements, but the same tool can be used in a different context and lead to very different results. So I try to pay attention to, for example, I'm an anti-nationalist. I'm generally, I believe in international culture. I believe we should all try to get along, right? Even if we're proud of our culture. But when I see someone doing a Mexican folkloric ballet in Queens, I get very excited because here they're using their culture to bond with others in really vulnerable positions. That's very different than a Mexican politician using his nationalism to abuse someone. You know, like they're different uses of the same thing. And so I think it's really important that we pay attention to how the culture and the activism is being used. Does that answer the question? At least, well, it's a question from I hope it does.
There's another question has been asked. What or who was your inspiration?
I mean, honestly, I always cared. I always paid attention to social injustice, even as a young kid. My parents somehow taught me to not ignore it. And so I feel like I was sensitized pretty early to that. Like if I saw a family living on the street in Mexico, which is unfortunately something that people just get used to and they erase it from their consciousness. and I just couldn't. It hurt every time, you know, and it still does. And so it's as busy as we are and as hard as it is to, I think being sensitive to other people's suffering is to me foundational, but I always kind of kept that separate from my art making. So in terms of the question of inspiration, it wasn't until I kind of reached my 20s that I thought of even combining art and activism, because for me, inspiration was an art, like a thing for art. And I was inspired by Matisse and by Diego Rivera, you know, by artists. I wasn't inspired by activists. If anything, I was inspired by Tesla or scientists or inventors, you know, and I wanted to be like them. I wasn't inspired by activists. I wasn't inspired by political thinkers. In fact, I mostly despised them, you know? And it was only because of that gradual being sensitive, more and more sensitive to other people's suffering and doing something about it, that I became more of an activist. And then I realized long enough later that, wait, I'm an artist, so I can also, I don't have to separate these two things. They can actually sometimes go together, not always, but they can go, you know. I don't think artists need to be active. I think, in fact, some artists shouldn't be, you know, like it's just like some artists shouldn't be teachers because they're bad at it, you know. And so I think in terms of inspiration, right now, I'm very inspired by the young generation in terms of activism. I think they're doing things that are, I mean, sometimes youth can be annoying because people are naive and they're, you know, and they have very simplified views of the world. But at the same time, the energy they're bringing into these discussions, you know, and some of the ideas that they have are really sophisticated. I think it's not how we were 20 years ago. I think the current youth has a lot of this stuff figured out. Like when Silent Sam came down at UNC Chapel Hill, I was really impressed with them. And that was mostly people 18 to 22 who did that, you know? And you may disagree with them having done it, but you still have to admire how they did it, how they got away with it, you know, like, and it was not violent. It was peaceful, but it was not easy to do, you know, and we wouldn't have been able to do it. And if I put myself in their age, you know?
So we have another question asking you to sort of look out into the future a little bit. What are spaces that art as activism has yet to inhabit in our world? Where do you hope to experiment with social activist art next?
I mean, I think I want to give an answer that is a bit more unexpected. Of course, there's lots of spaces we can talk about that are recognized as spaces, but having done all this work and as one of my personal obsessions as an artist, but also as a teacher and so on, is public space. And that's why so much of these MOOCs are about public space. But I would say private space is underexplored. Like, for example, the family, you know, the workspace, like all of these spaces. Imagine if you went to work and there was an artistic thing happening at work. And I'm not talking about putting a painting on the wall of your office, you know, I'm talking about like once a week, there's some artistic intervention, you know, like, and it helps us think through certain difficult things, but also it's more enjoyable than going, you know, than having a political discussion or, you know, having a, you know, because it's art, you know, and it's weird and it's fun, you know, and so I think same in the family space. Like I try to think of our family, for example, here, my wife who also teaches at Duke and our daughter, like we do sometimes things that are unusual, but because we're experimenting with stuff, you know, we're just kind of figuring it out. So she was my collaborator in this 3-year-long project at an arts camp in New York. It's if not the largest, one of the largest in the country. It's like I worked with 1,500 kids, ages 4 to 18, for 3 years in a row every summer. And my daughter came along with me, and we were riding the bus together. I was the only adult, other than the driver, and with all these kids. And it was just the right age to do it because she was 6, 7, and 8, like 3 years in a row. And now she would think, now it would be terrible. She would think it's the most embarrassing thing to do, to have her dad in this bus, you know? But at the time she was happy and proud, and we really talked about all these ideas. And I loved hanging out with these kids, like talking about what they would do with the buses and what they would do with the swimming pool and what they, like to think of themselves as artists, and as urban planners and so on. And so I think there's so much underexplored space there in our private, intimate lives that I would encourage anyone who cares for creativity to try things out there. And that's kind of what the MOOCs also try to do. That's why, and maybe the question about the false advertisement could have also been about that. Maybe that person expected a more straightforward, like, we're doing activism on this or on that, And I have done that type of work, but it's not the work that I shared. And with the MOOC, we try to keep it open so that people learn some techniques on how to, hold someone's attention, but ultimately they have to choose their topic. I'm not going to tell you what you should be an activist about, and the best way to do it. Yes.
We have a final question from our audience here, which is whether or not Duke parents, not alums, but parents of Duke students can get involved, can sign up for these courses if they have an interest.
Yes, for sure. In fact, one of the reasons I went with Coursera, and I've insisted that the other courses on Coursera you have to pay for, and some of them are more expensive than others. But all of the ones in my series are free unless you want a certificate. So that's important an important distinction. So anyone, Duke or not, like people from around the world that have nothing to, it's mostly people who have nothing to do with Duke who take these courses. And so when you sign up, just make sure you sign up without the certificate, especially if you don't need the certificate for anything. For example, some of my learners, they do want to work in an art institution and so on. So it matters that they show that they took it and that they passed, that they reached all the way to the end. So the certificate matters to them, and it's not expensive, but you do pay for it. But without the certificate, you can take it entirely for free, all of them, and go as far into it as you want, or just drop halfway through. For sure, yeah.
Wonderful. I think we have a couple more minutes before we wrap up. So I'm just going to exercise personal privilege here and bring it back to North Carolina, since we all have some connection, I think, to that. In just a couple minutes, can you talk about, you mentioned some of the changes that you'd seen in North Carolina. What stands out in your mind the most in that respect?
What stands out the most is that when I moved here in 2002, to me, it has nothing to do with Democrat or Republican. It just, when I moved here, I was quickly asked, like only a few years later, I was asked to serve on the North Carolina Arts Council board to help the governor at the time to kind of see how the budget should be used. That's what the board does. They advise the governor. And we were working together with Republicans, Democrats, different groups. But to me, the landscape has changed so dramatically and so negatively because everybody has become a cartoon of themselves and of each other. Like they kind of, I hope that North Carolina was kind of at the avant-garde of what then became a national trend, right? And it has to do with deliberate misrepresentation, not listening to people, all the way to extreme gerrymandering, right? And so on. And I think that hopefully we can learn to just step back, like, and maybe do it at that smaller level, like listen less to politicians and do it, like, for example, think of, if you live in North Carolina, think, where do your kids go to school? Does everybody really agree on everything in your kid's school? Well, no. But with them, you're not going to get into a fist fight. You're not going to get, like, social media is really the worst place to figure out so many of things that we're trying to do with social media. And I think we should stop, And the reason I think of it in terms of the North Carolina question is because I feel like it started here much before. New Yorkers were living in denial about this many years after we already had to deal with it, because we were used, even in I remember when immigrants from across the US used to come to North Carolina because it was such a welcoming place. And also you could get a license here, because people wanted people to drive safely and so on. It's not because they were doing anything wrong, And then there was this federal anti-license law, that during the Bush years was passed. And it was actually nothing that was planned in North Carolina. DMVs in North Carolina didn't want that. They wanted immigrants to have their licenses. But I remember this advertising campaign that had billboards with Osama bin Laden holding a driver's license, and the license said, and the billboard said, "I got it in North Carolina," right? And what people don't know is that that campaign was paid for by a New York law, like a firm, not law, like a New York advertising firm that paid for those billboards because they were using North Carolina as a little bit of a guinea pig for these types of campaigns, you know? And so I feel like we were an early experiment of something that has gone quite wrong. And no matter where you stand in the political spectrum, I hope we can become neighbors again and you know, and friends and so on, and really put aside these horrible simplifications and distortions that we have to live with.
Well, you brought us right back to the power of imagery with your last answer. So thank you for that. And I will turn it back over to our hosts at Duke.
Thanks, Jose.